It started with a garden, a small, raised bed tucked neatly along the side of the Carter family's cream-colored house, framed by trimmed hedges and a wooden fence that had been painted a little too eagerly by the previous owners. There wasn't anything special about the garden. Not really. A few herbs, some cherry tomatoes, basil that was always overgrown by midweek. But Naomi loved it. She said it gave her hands something to do while her mind stayed still. That morning, the neighborhood was quiet, unnaturally so. No lawnmowers, no kids on bikes, just the chirp of birds and the occasional rustle of leaves as the early sunlight filtered through the trees. It was the kind of silence that made you aware of your own breath. Naomi Carter, dressed in an old hoodie and sweats, knelt in the soil with gloved hands, gently pruning wilted leaves from her basil. A faint smile tugged at the corner of her lips. Her earbuds played a quiet instrumental playlist. No lyrics, just piano and strings. She'd found the playlist on a random night when sleep wouldn't come. Now it was part of her routine, her peace. The world at that moment was soft. But soft things don't last. Not in places like this. Not for people like her. Across the street, a curtain shifted. Just slightly. A vertical snap of movement in a window too high for coincidence. Naomi didn't turn her head. She didn't need to. That window always moved when she stepped outside alone. She had noticed it on day 2 of moving in. Just like she had noticed the way Mrs. Teller from 3 doors down always pulled her dog closer when passing Naomi's house, even though Naomi had never owned a pet. Just like the time the HOA had left a warning letter in her mailbox for not coiling her hose properly, twice in 1 week. She hadn't been surprised, just tired. Still, Naomi focused on the soil. She pressed her gloved thumbs into the earth, checking moisture. Too dry. She made a note to water after she was done trimming. She liked being out early, before the world decided what kind of day it was going to be. Before it could choose the headlines, the looks, the misunderstandings. In the distance, a car door slammed. Then another. The slam wasn't angry. Not rushed. Just official. Like someone stamping a file closed. Naomi pulled off one glove and wiped a bead of sweat from her forehead. The sun was already creeping higher. A neighbor across the street, Mr. Langston, was standing on his porch. Staring. No wave. No smile. Just staring. A tightness pulled at Naomi's chest, the kind she knew not to ignore. Behind her, a second-story window creaked open. Voices filtered through, muffled at first, then sharp. Yeah, she's still out there. She's been out there too long. You sure it's safe to? The window slammed shut. Naomi sat back on her heels and pulled out one earbud. Her heartbeat was steady, but she was listening now. Fully. Another car door. This one closer. Then came the sound no one ever wants to hear in their own neighborhood. Sirens. Distant at first, barely more than a hum. But growing. Fast. And deliberate. Not the kind that wanders through traffic looking for a place to be. No. This was focused. This was coming here. Naomi stood slowly. Her gloves dangled from one hand. The other hovered near her waistband, where her phone was clipped. She turned toward the street, just in time to see the first police cruiser cut the corner onto their road, tires screeching slightly as it straightened out. Then a second, and a third. No lights, just the sirens. Loud, piercing. Naomi didn't move. One of the cars stopped dead in front of her driveway. 2 officers jumped out. One shouted something, but the sirens drowned it out. Naomi reached for her phone. She thought maybe she should call her husband, Michael, but her fingers froze. Because that's when she saw the guns. Drawn. Both officers. Not lowered. Not cautious. Drawn. The second car pulled up behind the first. Then the third. Neighbors stepped onto their porches now, emerging like ghosts in a fog. Each one blinking as if they hadn't expected this to escalate this way, though some had dialed the number that made this happen. Naomi raised her hands. No sudden movements. She hadn't said a word yet. Didn't need to. The officers approached, shouting over one another. Commands barked in rapid fire. Put your hands up. Step back. Do not move. Her hoodie. Her gloves. Her skin. That's all it took. She opened her mouth, but no sound came. There was no point in arguing with weapons. Not here. Not like this. The red lasered from one officer's pistol danced over her chest. Just slightly off-center, like a misplaced question mark. And in that instant, something inside Naomi cracked. Not fear, not panic, but a cold, sobering realization. They weren't here to ask. They were here to assume. She lowered her eyes and took one step back, carefully placing her gloves on the ground. She crouched slightly, palms open and facing them. But even then, her voice was quiet. Calm. Trained. I live here. The officers shouted again. Someone behind them, maybe a senior officer, ordered her to get on the ground. Naomi hesitated. She was wearing sweatpants. Her knees were already dirty. The soil was clinging to her like a second skin. But it didn't matter. None of it mattered. She dropped to her knees, then slowly lay face down in her own front yard. From this angle, she could see her tomato plants bending in the breeze. One of them had overgrown the edge of the garden box. She had meant to trim it this morning. Across the street, Mr. Langston was still watching. A woman next door was filming with her phone. No one said a word. No one asked the officers, why her? No one said, she lives here. No one screamed, stop. And Naomi didn't scream either. Because she knew. She had seen what happened when people screamed. She had read the names, memorized them like prayers. She had walked past their faces printed on signs. She had mourned them from a distance. Not today. Today, she would not scream. She would remember. Remember the faces of those who stood by. The trembling voice of the young officer who couldn't meet her eyes. The neighbors who had never spoken to her, but decided they understood enough to dial 911. The third cop who walked around her, as if inspecting a fallen object. She counted seconds, then breaths, then heartbeats. Someone radioed something. Another officer approached with zip ties. And still, Naomi said nothing. Not yet. Not until they had seen what they had done. Not until she reminded them who she was. And just like that, the calm was gone. Guns pointed. No explanation. No warning. Just red dots on her chest. If you're already holding your breath, if your chest tightened reading that last line, if you've ever felt like the world could turn on you without asking your name, then you need to hear what happens next. Go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe, because Naomi's story is just beginning. And you won't want to miss what comes after this. Before the sirens, before the shouts, before the red dots painted her chest, there was just a woman trying to live quietly. Naomi Carter had always preferred stillness over noise. She was the kind of person who walked into a room and didn't need to announce herself. She didn't wear bold colors or chase attention. She listened more than she spoke. And when she did speak, people usually stopped to listen, because she didn't waste words. But in Maple Ridge, silence didn't earn you respect. It made you suspicious. She and her husband, Michael, had moved into the neighborhood just 6 months ago. It was supposed to be a fresh start, clean air, good schools, well-lit streets, the kind of place you could let your guard down just enough to exhale. Michael had landed a promotion that came with a relocation package, and Naomi had finally agreed to leave the chaos of DC behind for something quieter, something safer. It wasn't the kind of place they ever imagined being judged for planting a garden. But that's how it started. The welcome packet came with a smile, tight and polite. The realtor's voice was syrup sweet. You'll love it here. Great community. Very respectful. Family-friendly. Naomi had nodded, her fingers brushing over the glossy pages of HOA bylaws and landscaping rules. She didn't miss the way the woman hesitated before the word respectful. She'd heard that tone before, the one that meant, you'll be safe here as long as you don't remind them you're different. At first, Naomi didn't take it personally. She unpacked boxes, painted rooms, dug out weeds from the backyard that had been neglected by the last owners. She even joined a local garden club online, though no one replied to her post introducing herself. Just a couple of thumbs up and one message. Are you sure you're in the right group? It wasn't an outright insult, but it lingered like smoke. Then came the trash can notices. The HOA sent them in pastel-colored envelopes, addressed to resident. One was for leaving her bin out past 8 a.m. the day after collection. Another warned her about using the wrong mulch color. Naomi reread that one 3 times, thinking maybe it was a mistake. It wasn't. The mulch was apparently supposed to match the earth tones approved in the community landscape palette. Meanwhile, she watched kids ride skateboards down the sidewalk, crash into mailboxes, and leave without a word. She watched neighbors park their cars on the curb overnight. An HOA violation, and no warning letter followed. She noticed everything. She always had. Naomi had spent a lifetime moving through rooms where she was underestimated. She had worn uniforms that made her invisible, sat in meetings where men talked over her until she shut them down with a single raised eyebrow. She had been trained in war zones to calculate every threat, every angle, every escape. But now, she was being profiled for planting rosemary too close to the fence. Michael tried to laugh it off. "Babe, maybe they're just strict with everyone." She had smiled, but she didn't laugh, because she knew. She had seen the way their neighbors smiled through clenched jaws, how they avoided eye contact when she waved, how their tone changed when Michael was with her, less guarded, more performative. And still, Naomi never confronted anyone. She didn't rage. She didn't report. She didn't scream, because that's not how she survived. Naomi observed. She learned who owned which dog, who walked every morning at 7 o'clock, who left their porch lights on past midnight. She knew who planted the lilies that lined the HOA president's walkway, who jogged with earbuds in and who pretended to. She watched the couple down the street argue in hushed tones every other Thursday. She knew which neighbor always left his car engine idling just a little too long when she was outside. She saw the girl across the street draw her curtains whenever Naomi opened her front door. She noted the way certain voices dropped to whispers when she walked by. And yet, none of them ever asked her name. They called her Miss, or Ma'am, or "You must be Michael's wife." Never Naomi, never neighbor. Just a presence they couldn't quite place and wouldn't take the time to understand. That's how the neighborhood saw her. Quiet, private, probably cold, a little too reserved. But Naomi wasn't cold. She was calculating, not in the sinister way they assumed, but in the way only someone trained to read danger could be. Every time she stepped outside, she measured her footsteps. Every outfit was chosen carefully. Neutral colors, nothing baggy, hair tied back, sunglasses off, hands visible. Her earbuds were wireless, so there were no cords to mistake for something else. Her phone was clipped on her side, not in a pocket where it could be misidentified. Even her gardening gloves were chosen with care. Soft green, non-threatening, with a floral print. Because she knew that in some zip codes, even cotton could be seen as a threat. She didn't dress for comfort. She dressed to survive comfort's illusion. And yet, despite all of that, it still happened. Despite 6 months of quiet living, of smiling without being smiled back, of complying with rules that no one else seemed to follow, the sirens still came. The guns still raised. The assumptions still won. Because Naomi Carter didn't look like what they expected. Not for that house. Not for that zip code. Not for that neighborhood. To them, she didn't look like someone who belonged. But none of them knew who she really was. They didn't know about the missions she'd led overseas. The lives she'd saved in places where the soil burned hotter than any backyard garden. They didn't know about the sleepless nights spent learning enemy dialects, or the years she spent mastering tactics most officers only dreamed of. They didn't know that Naomi could disarm a man twice her size in less than 4 seconds. They didn't know she had received medals that were never publicly named because the missions were classified, because her name, to them, was irrelevant. Just a file, just a number. She had lived in shadows to protect a country that now saw her as one. And still, she kept her silence. Not because she was weak, but because strength doesn't always scream. Sometimes it waits, watches, calculates, and when the time is right, it reminds everyone in the room exactly who they were dealing with. But that morning, as she lay in her own yard with knees pressed into damp soil and red dots dancing across her hoodie, Naomi wasn't thinking about power. She was thinking about the garden, about how something as simple as planting basil in the morning light had turned into an act of suspicion. She was thinking about every time she had swallowed discomfort to avoid confrontation. Every time she had smiled just to seem approachable. Every meeting where she softened her tone so she wouldn't be labeled angry. Every dinner party where she let people mispronounce her name because correcting them made the room too quiet. She thought about all of it, and still, she didn't speak. Not yet, because silence in the right hands could be a weapon. And Naomi Carter was no stranger to weapons. They thought she was quiet because she was weak. But Naomi wasn't hiding. She was observing. And when the moment came, she was ready. Can you already feel the tension building? Have you ever lived in a place where you were watched more than welcomed? Where your silence was mistaken for submission? If you have, you're not alone. Drop a comment if you've ever been judged for how you look or where you live. And don't forget to subscribe. We're just getting started. The world, once muted by morning quiet, had erupted into commands and confusion. Get on the ground. Now, put your hands where I can see them. Naomi Carter didn't flinch. Not at the volume. Not at the urgency. Not even when she saw the officers moving as if she had the weapon. She had been yelled at before. On military bases. In training. In live combat. She had heard the bark of orders meant to strip the fear from her bones. But these voices were different. These voices weren't commanding out of training. They were shouting out of fear. A fear shaped not by her actions, but by her skin, her presence, her stillness. The red laser sights from their pistols still quivered against her chest. She didn't blink, didn't cry, didn't speak. Instead, she calculated. 2 officers in front, early 30s, both sweating despite the cool morning air. One more by the cruiser, hand hovering near the radio on his shoulder. Backup. Behind her, another door creaked open. A screen door this time. Mrs. Palmer, from the corner house, stepped out holding a cup of coffee like this was her morning entertainment. She didn't speak, just sipped and stared. To Naomi's left, someone had started recording. A phone propped in shaky hands. Her reflection flickered across the glass screen. A woman on her knees, surrounded by men with guns. No context, no captions, just a 30-second video waiting to go viral for the wrong reasons. Naomi could feel the weight of every eye on her. She wasn't just surrounded by neighbors. She was surrounded by silence. A dangerous kind of silence. Not the respectful kind. The complicit kind. No one stepped forward. No one asked a question. No one challenged the officers. Not a single person said, "She lives here." Naomi slowly bent her knees and lowered herself into the soil. She moved as if underwater, measured, slow, unthreatening. She had done this 100 times in drills, de-escalation through posture. She lay flat, arms extended, palms down, her cheek pressed into the cold ground. Her garden was less than 2 feet away. She could smell the rosemary. She had planted it herself. Now it bent slightly in the breeze, swaying like it didn't know it was part of a crime scene. A boot thudded near her head. One officer stood above her, breathing heavily, sweat rolling down his temple. The gun in his hand still trembled, not because of the weight, but because of the story he had already told himself. She's dangerous. She doesn't belong. She's a threat. And now, that story was trying to justify the gun in his grip. "Keep your hands where I can see them," he barked again, though Naomi hadn't moved. She lay perfectly still, the same way she had been trained to play dead in a hostile zone. The same way she had waited in silence for helicopters in countries most Americans couldn't pronounce. But this wasn't a foreign war zone. This was her front yard. The soil under her fingernails belonged to her garden. The porch behind her was hers. The security camera above the door was hers. And yet, none of that mattered, because truth didn't travel faster than fear. Another officer moved to her side. The zip ties were ready, but she could tell they were unsure. The aggression had outpaced the logic. Now, but they were stuck. They had drawn their guns too early. They had escalated before they asked. And walking it back wasn't just embarrassing, it was risky. Naomi still said nothing. Not because she was frozen, but because she was choosing not to educate people with weapons. The real power wasn't in what she said. It was in what she withheld. Because they wanted her to plead, to explain, to defend her right to be there. And Naomi Carter would not do that. Behind the squad cars, another neighbor leaned against a mailbox. He whispered to someone beside him, "This is what happens when you ignore the HOA." Naomi heard it, even with her face in the grass. She heard it, but she didn't react, because reactions feed assumptions. Instead, she observed. The cop with the radio was now mumbling into it, his voice low, nervous. Words like subject detained and possible mistake floated through the air like smoke from a burning house. A mistake. That's what they call it. A mistake with guns. A mistake with red dots. A mistake in uniform. Naomi didn't believe in mistakes like that. She believed in consequences, in accountability, in systems that were designed, not broken. And she was taking mental notes, not just of the cops, but of the neighbors, of the HOA board members she recognized standing on their lawns, pretending not to watch, of the phone cameras turned on only after the guns came out. She was cataloging everything, because this moment wasn't new. It was ancient, branded into American history like a watermark under every declaration of freedom. And Naomi Carter knew history better than most, not from books, but from the things she had survived while protecting a country that still questioned her right to exist in a hoodie. Time slowed. A beetle crawled near her hand. The officer shifted beside her. The zip tie slipped slightly as he tightened it. Too tight, but she didn't complain. She lay there, face pressed in her own lawn, listening to the hush of shame settle over the scene. One cop coughed. Another adjusted his belt. The radios fell quiet. And still she said nothing, because silence, when chosen, can echo louder than a scream. Because sometimes dignity is the refusal to perform for people who already wrote the ending. They had her on the ground, face pressed in her own lawn. And still, she hadn't said a word, because they hadn't earned it. If that silence made your chest tighten, you're not alone. If you've ever seen someone keep their power by refusing to explain themselves to ignorance, then you understand Naomi. Like this video, if you've ever seen the world treat silence as weakness when it was actually strength. And don't forget to subscribe, because Naomi's story is far from over. Time didn't slow down, it stopped. The world, once spinning in sirens and voices, was now suspended in a single, suffocating moment. Naomi Carter lay still, her breath steady beneath the zip tie biting into her wrist. She could hear the shuffling of boots on her driveway, the awkward coughs of officers realizing this wasn't going the way they thought it would. A quiet had settled. Not peace, but the kind of silence that chokes after something shameful. She didn't move right away. She waited, counted 5 breaths, let the tension simmer just enough to make them question themselves. Then, slowly, she lifted her head. Not fully, just enough to speak. Her voice didn't crack, didn't waver. It was measured, calm, controlled. "May I retrieve my identification?" It was the first full sentence she'd spoken since they arrived. And somehow, it rang louder than any of their earlier shouting. The officer closest to her blinked. His hands twitched near his holster. "WH what?" Naomi didn't repeat herself. She didn't need to. Her tone had cut through his fear like glass slicing a quiet room. "I would like to show you my ID," she said again, slower this time. No anger, just precision. "It's in my waistband pouch. Left side." The officer hesitated. His eyes darted to his partner, then to the others behind him. For a moment, it seemed like no one knew what to do. They were trained for chaos, but not for correction. Not like this. One of them stepped forward cautiously. He gestured to her waist. "I'm going to reach for it." "Okay." Naomi nodded once. He knelt down and retrieved the black leather ID wallet clipped to her side. It was worn from years of use, but still crisp. Inside, tucked neatly beneath a laminate cover, was a badge they didn't recognize. Delta Force, a name they heard, a division they didn't think existed outside action movies. And yet, there it was, stamped in gold and black, staring back at them with silent authority. The officer flipped it open. Then again, his lips moved, reading something under his breath. His jaw tightened. Naomi watched his face. Confusion first, then disbelief, then a dawning kind of fear. Not the type that makes you pull a trigger, but the kind that makes you realize you've already fired a shot, even if metaphorically. He stood up slowly, held the badge like it might burn him. The others gathered close, whispered, looked at her, then back at the ID, then at each other. The air changed. Radios buzzed. Low tones, muffled urgency. Cancel code read. Possible misidentification. Request supervisor on site. No one looked her in the eye. Naomi pushed herself up, sitting back on her heels. She didn't stand. Not yet. The zip tie was still tight around her wrists. The officer who had read her badge was now pale. His lips moved again, but no words came out. Another officer, older, more decorated, stepped in. His face was stiff, controlled. He kneeled beside her, not out of empathy, but out of protocol. "Ma'am," he said, clearing his throat, we made a mistake. The call we received described, Naomi tilted her head slightly, just enough to make him pause. She didn't need to hear the rest. He wasn't apologizing. He was trying to explain away a gun to the chest. Still zip-tied, still kneeling, still violated in her own front yard. And now they wanted to talk. The officers seemed to shrink under the weight of her silence. One of the younger cops, the one who had trembled from the beginning, finally broke. "Ma'am, I'm sorry." His voice was barely audible. Naomi turned toward him. For the first time, her eyes fully met one of theirs. There was no fire in her gaze, no rage, but there was something worse for them, clarity. Because in that one glance, Naomi let him see everything. The injustice, the restraint, the truth of what they'd just done, and more importantly, what they could never undo. The neighbors, still scattered across porches and behind fences, began to stir. Phones lowered. Conversation started. A few glanced at each other, confused, unsettled, maybe embarrassed. But none stepped forward. None offered a hand. None said they were sorry. Because that's the thing about bystanders. They love a show until the credits roll, and they realize they were part of it too. One officer fumbled with a small knife and reached to cut the zip tie. Naomi lifted her wrists. The plastic snapped with a quiet tick. She didn't rub her skin, didn't wince, didn't speak. She stood, slow, controlled, tall. For the first time, the officers seemed smaller than her. She reached out, took the ID from the officer's hand, and tucked it neatly back in her pouch. The silence held like a breath that no one could release. And Naomi just stood there, surrounded by people who only saw her clearly after they had tried to erase her. But it was too late. The guns had already been pointed. The shame couldn't be unsaid. Have you ever seen someone regret their actions only after the damage was done? They never expected Naomi to have power, because they never imagined someone like her belonged here. But maybe that's the point. Drop a comment if this moment hit you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button, because Naomi's just getting started. Naomi didn't speak as she walked back into the house. She didn't glance at the neighbors, didn't check who was still watching. She didn't return the murmured apologies floating weakly across the lawn, the half-hearted ways of those who had stayed quiet when it mattered most. She simply walked, one step at a time, up the porch, through the door, into the silence. Inside, the house felt colder, not in temperature, but in weight. Like the walls had heard everything. Like even the furniture was holding its breath. Michael stood frozen in the hallway. The text from a neighbor had reached him minutes too late. He had tried to call. She hadn't answered. Tried to race home. Too much traffic. And now here she was, his wife, his partner, his Naomi. Her clothes were smeared with dirt. A red indentation wrapped around her wrists. Her face was calm. Too calm. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Naomi met his eyes, then walked past him without saying a word. She didn't need to speak yet. Not until she had space. Not until she was no longer seen as a suspect in her own skin. She showered, slowly, let the water run down her back until the shaking stopped. Until the memory of the zip tie faded into steam. Until her knees no longer stung from gravel. When she stepped out, she didn't dry her tears. She let them fall into the towel, silent and warm. Michael waited. He didn't push. He didn't pry. He just sat on the edge of the bed, eyes locked on the floor. Finally, Naomi sat beside him. She spoke in full sentences, with measured pauses. Like a report, she told him everything. Not just what happened, but how it happened. The tone of the officers, the laser sights, the silence of the neighbors. The way she could still smell rosemary as she lay face down in the soil she had planted. Michael didn't cry, but his hands curled into fists so tight his knuckles turned white. He wanted to scream, to break something, to confront every officer, every neighbor, every coward who stood by. But Naomi placed a hand on his arm, gently. "Not yet," she said, because this wasn't about rage. This was about reckoning. That night, Naomi sat at the dining table, a cup of untouched tea cooling beside her. She pulled out a notebook, not a laptop, not a phone. A notebook, leather-bound, the kind she used during field debriefs when digital signals were too risky. She wrote everything down, every detail, every command, every face. She remembered the exact time the sirens arrived, the make and model of each cruiser, the badge numbers, the direction of the sun when she first saw the guns, the shade of a neighbor's robe who filmed and said nothing. She didn't write with emotion. She wrote with precision, because that's what this moment demanded. Truth, not anger. Clarity, not chaos. When she was done, she closed the notebook and placed it gently beside her badge. The next morning, she woke early, dressed sharply, not to impress, but to disarm. She drove herself to the local precinct. She filed a formal complaint, not just against the officers, but against the dispatcher who didn't ask the right questions, against the department's response time that came fast with force but slow with sense. And she didn't stop there, because Naomi understood what most people missed. The police didn't start this. The HOA did. It was their whispers, their letters, their coded language, their silence, their power. So she filed a formal grievance with the city's Housing Oversight Board, documented every incident since move-in day, every passive-aggressive notice, every regulation unequally enforced, every smile that masked suspicion, every complaint that led to this moment. She printed screenshots of the online HOA group, where residents used words like keep the neighborhood clean and watch for unfamiliar activity. She highlighted phrases like, we need to be more vigilant, and someone should check what she's doing. Naomi didn't demand an apology. She demanded accountability, because she wasn't looking for pity. She was looking for a shift, and word spread fast. By the afternoon, the same neighbors who once avoided eye contact now stumbled over themselves to appear neighborly. A woman from 2 doors down brought muffins she never baked before. Mr. Langston offered to help with anything you might need. Mrs. Palmer, the one who sipped coffee while Naomi was on the ground, stopped by with a note that read, I didn't know what was happening. I'm so sorry if I made it worse. But Naomi didn't flinch, didn't scowl, didn't even respond. Because sorry, spoken in safety, means nothing when you stood in silence during danger. The apologies weren't for Naomi. They were for themselves, to ease their own guilt, to scrub their conscience clean. But Naomi didn't want clean. She wanted truth. And the truth was simple. They were fine watching her on the ground, until they found out who she was. Only then did her humanity register. Only then did her value become visible. And that was the real crime. That's what she wanted them to see. So Naomi kept her distance. She declined invitations. She walked past the muffins. She let the sorries fall like broken raindrops against stone. Because this wasn't about comfort. It was about consequence. Her garden remained untouched. Not out of fear, but as a symbol. Let grow wild. Let the basil bolt and the tomatoes split. Let them see it and remember. Let remind them every single day of what they did when all she wanted was peace. And so, while the neighbors whispered their apologies and the officers shifted nervously behind desks, Naomi got to work. She wasn't done. She was just beginning. They thought the moment was over. But the real reckoning hadn't even begun. If you're rooting for Naomi right now, if you've ever wanted the system to answer, not just apologize, then this story is for you. Hit that like button. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe, because silence doesn't keep us safe. Truth does. The meeting room smelled of lemon polish and false civility. Rows of identical plastic chairs faced a long folding table where the HOA board members sat stiffly, pens in hand, smiles painted on like war masks. A coffee urn hissed quietly in the back, untouched. The air buzzed with a peculiar tension, the kind that floats just above the surface when people are preparing to defend themselves without knowing how they're going to do it. Naomi Carter walked in, not as a guest, not as a resident looking to vent, but as a reckoning in human form. She wasn't dressed for confrontation. She wore slate gray slacks, a tucked blouse, no jewelry except her wedding ring. Her posture was perfect, not rigid, just centered. Still, A presence you couldn't ignore, even if you tried. And many of them had. Now, they couldn't look away. A few turned in their seats. Some nodded. Most didn't know what to say, so they said nothing. That she was used to. She took a seat near the front. Not at the head, not in the back, right in the middle, where she could be seen but not centered, not tokenized. Just heard. The meeting began with the usual pleasantries. Updates on fence repairs, lawn care standards, parking space etiquette, but no mention of what had happened. No mention of the sirens, the red dots, the zip ties, the silence. Until Naomi stood. She didn't raise her hand, didn't ask for permission. She simply rose, and the room shifted. No one interrupted. Not at first. She cleared her throat gently, looked each board member in the eye, one by one, and then she spoke. Calm, measured, direct. There's been a sickness in this neighborhood. You may not have named it, but you felt it. You fed it. And now it's grown into something you can no longer pretend not to see. No raised voice, no dramatics, just facts. Truth, uncoded. 6 months ago, my husband and I moved here for peace. We bought a home. We followed the rules. But the rules weren't the same for us. Not really. You made sure of that. Whispers. A shift in the back. Someone rustled papers. Naomi continued. Some of you watched as I was harassed over mulch color. Trash bins. Gardening. Minor things. Repeatedly. You said it was policy. I followed your policies. But others broke them without consequence. And still, you said nothing. A man near the front raised his hand. Try to cut in. Naomi turned to him slowly. Her eyes didn't narrow. Her face didn't shift. She just looked at him, and he shrank. She didn't have to say a word. The stare alone silenced him. She turned back to the board. I was treated like a threat, not because I did anything wrong, but because you've built a culture here that confuses difference with danger. A beat passed. No one looked up. You didn't just fail to protect me, she said, her voice softer now. You helped create the reason I needed protecting in the first place. Someone whispered, "That's not fair," under their breath. Naomi heard it, ignored it. She reached into her bag and pulled out a document. Her ID, her credentials, neatly placed in a transparent folder. She sat on the table in front of the board and stepped back slightly. "This," she said, "is who I am." Silence. Delta Force. National security clearance. Global deployments. Commendations classified. Not a resume. Not a plea. Just the truth. I've spent years protecting this country, putting my life on the line for people I never met. For freedom. For justice. For the very idea of safety. She looked around the room again. And yet, none of that stopped this community from pointing suspicion at me for watering my garden. No one moved. No one could. Because in that moment, they weren't sitting across from a woman in slacks and a blouse. They were facing the reality of their own reflection. Naomi stepped forward again. "You didn't see a neighbor," she said, voice unwavering. "You saw a threat." And then, just before she sat down, she left them with one final truth. "And that says more about you than it ever did about me." The room stayed frozen. No one clapped. No one argued. No one offered a defense. Because what could they say? Their assumptions had already spoken for them. And in that room, full of power and privilege, Naomi stood taller than all of them. Comment, respect, if you felt that moment. If you've ever watched someone command a room with nothing but the truth, this chapter is for you. And don't forget to subscribe. We still have one final truth to uncover. The apology came in the form of a press release. Cold, polished, carefully worded. The department regrets the unfortunate misunderstanding that took place during a routine response to a resident call. We are reviewing protocols to ensure future encounters reflect our commitment to community safety and respect. There was no mention of red dots on her chest, no mention of zip ties, no names, no direct acknowledgement of her. Naomi read it once, then again, folded the paper in half, and tucked it away in a drawer. Because the words didn't matter. The action did, and over the next few weeks, she began to see it. Change, small and unsteady, but change nonetheless. The officer who had tried to handcuff her was reassigned to administrative duty. A formal investigation into the dispatcher's handling of the 911 call was opened. And at the next HOA board meeting, 3 longtime members quietly stepped down. No fanfare, no explanations, just absence. Some might have called it accountability. Naomi knew better. It was survival. They didn't leave because they understood. They left because staying meant confronting what they had helped create. But Naomi stayed. She and Michael remained in the same house, on the same street, with the same garden. Only now the garden had grown. Wider beds, brighter flowers, lavender near the gate, rosemary climbing the fence like it had something to say. Neighbors passed by more slowly now. Some waved. A few even smiled like they meant it. And occasionally, more often than before, someone stopped. Just for a moment. Your garden looks beautiful. What do you recommend for shade plants? I'm sorry I didn't say anything that day. Naomi didn't offer absolution. That wasn't hers to give. But she listened. And in the quiet moments that followed, change took root. Because something had shifted, not just in the neighborhood, but in the story they told themselves about who belonged here. Naomi didn't wear her badge in public. She never had. She didn't drape herself in medals or recount missions to strangers. She didn't need to, because her strength had never been in the uniform. It was in the way she walked past the same porch where someone once whispered into a phone about her suspicious activity and now offered her homemade cookies. It was in the way she looked people in the eye, not with bitterness, but with unflinching clarity. It was in the way she tended her garden, hands in the soil, knowing what had bloomed from that ground once carried the weight of injustice. Naomi never asked for attention, but now people noticed, not because she demanded it, but because they couldn't unsee her anymore. And maybe that's what this was always about. Not just the guns, or the zip ties, or the cowardice of silence, but the daily, grinding reality of being erased, overlooked, assumed. Naomi didn't just defend herself that day. She reminded them what strength really looks like. Measured, quiet, unapologetic. The kind of strength that doesn't have to prove anything, because it already is. But she also reminded them what it costs to live in a country where even heroes have to prove they belong, where honor must be documented, where safety depends on credentials, where skin determines suspicion before truth can even speak. This is America, too. Not the one in the pledges or the brochures, but the real one, where Naomi Carter gets profiled while planting basil, where her silence holds more power than their assumptions, where she has to survive a threat before anyone asks her name. And yet, she still gardens, still lives, still stands, because that's what resilience looks like. And maybe, just maybe, someone else will remember that the next time they feel the urge to whisper or assume or reach for fear before fact. Maybe they'll hesitate. Maybe they'll think. Maybe they'll choose better. Underscore. Final message. This wasn't just Naomi's story. This is the story of every person judged before they're heard. Every name that's been mistaken. Every glance that became a threat. Every silence that spoke louder than the gun. And maybe, just maybe, next time, they'll think twice before pulling the trigger of assumption. If this story hit home for you, if you felt seen, heard, or reminded of someone you know, like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe for more stories that speak the truth others are too afraid to tell. Because stories like Naomi's, they don't end. They echo.